We're here to interview Emeritus Professor Bal Saini in his home in Taringa, President John Macarthur and Janina.
It's the 9th of September 2013.
Thank you. Get the year in. Very good.
So we usually start by asking some questions about your architectural education. So the first question is
Even how I got into it? Or?
No. What qualifications did you gain and from which institutions and in which years?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, I had my architectural qualifications are from the University of Melbourne. Mm-hmm. Both at graduate level and postgraduate level.
Mm-hmm. And which year did you?
I graduated in architecture in 1954. Mm-hmm. And then I went away and came back. I went to India after that because I was a student. And I practiced in Delhi for about 4 years or so. And then I had a job offer in Melbourne University, my old school, an offer I couldn't refuse. Mm-hmm. And then I stayed there till 1973. Mm-hmm. And while I was at the University of Melbourne, the second time I enrolled for a PhD program. And the PhD program is entirely research-based. And I think I might have been probably the first PhD graduate in Australia. Mm-hmm. It's quite possible because in '66 there was no tradition for graduate program generally, and I know definitely because I couldn't find a supervisor. So I had to supervise myself, and that was a really a question of being dropped at the deep end of the water and learn to survive and swim.
And what was your PhD topic?
A PhD topic generally was because when I came back, I after a couple of years at the University of Melbourne, I was the Commonwealth government in Canberra, Department of Works, offered me a fellowship, a research fellowship, to spend a year in Papua New Guinea. Oh. And Papua New Guinea was still an Australian administered territory. Mm-hmm. And was on the verge of being independent. Mm-hmm. So they asked me to, help with the building industry and perhaps help set up some local, regional resources to manufacture building materials within the territory. Mm-hmm. And so I took it up as a interesting challenge because I had no support, but they gave me quite a lot of money to use up whichever way I wanted. And when I arrived in Port Moresby, they gave me an office which I never used. And then I thought, I was looking for a lot of information as to what was available, what were the services, what were the building materials, and what you could, use to establish something from nothing, more or less. And also realized that there was a very rich building, regional, traditional, vernacular tradition there. And so I did that research more or less on my own. I had a questionnaire and went around collecting this information, and I put it all together. And when I submitted that report to the Commonwealth Department of Works, it was suggested that we ought to establish a course in tropical architecture, graduate program at the University of Melbourne. And it was a year or so before, I think, the Architectural Association in London had a course which was run by a fellow called Dr. Otto Königsberger. Mm-hmm. He was an architect and a town planner, and he was he was head of the school at the time, and he was he did a lot of traveling in the ex-British colonies, mainly in Africa and so on. And he felt that there was a need for continued presence of architects and professional development in these countries, and they had to start from nothing. And so he established a course in tropical architecture at the AA. And that was actually a year before I started something similar in University of Melbourne, largely encouraged by my work in Papua New Guinea. And I have used for the following 2-3 decades Papua New Guinea as my sort of field laboratory. I knew a lot of the people there who are now currently the leaders of people like Michael Smari and John Guys and so on. And at that time they were also establishing the University of Technology in Leh. And I had been involved with that in terms of both its planning to some extent. It's mainly done by Jim Birrell, but I was involved in the administrative end of it and policy end of it. And then when they established the university, they put me on the university council. And one of my first tasks was to establish courses in architecture and building. So I set up a committee and chaired a committee which decided to establish a formal course in architecture and building with greater emphasis on building rather than architecture as such. And so this was happening all in the 1960s.
Going back a bit, Bal, when you started architecture at Melbourne, who were the teachers that struck you as personalities, and who inspired you?
Well, my first year teacher in my first year was Roy Grounds.
Right.
And Roy Grounds almost became my mentor and very close friend from then on. And we kept in touch with each other right till he died, almost. I never worked in his office as such, but I used to end up dining with the family, and they were very close friends of Zara and Harold Holt, the Prime Minister of who also died in a sea while swimming. So got to know people used to call him a one-way swimmer.
Long conspiracy
So
theories.
this
he
is
was taken by a Chinese submarine.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
His
all
body
kinds of rumors.
Yeah.
And they were next door neighbors of Grounds. And so I often used to call in there, and Holtz used to drop in, and it was that kind of scene in which. So the first year teacher was Roy Grounds.
What was Grounds' role in the school? Because he must have been the
He was just looking
after.
after the first year studio work, and Roy will carry on full-time practice.
Yes, amazing.
And we were allowed in the architecture school in Melbourne full-time practice, but we never had time to do both properly anyway. And that's a decision I had to make later on, whether I wanted to go full-time practice or go into education, and education won because I already has a foot in the camp. But that's a dilemma most architects at that stage face, whether they want to practice. They want to do both, but they soon find out that they can't do both properly if they want to do it. They need time, and so sooner or later, either you end up doing both of them not so well, or choose one or the other and do it properly. And I chose education. But as in my student days, the other people I remember was Ray Berg, who looked after me in 4th year. And in 5th year, I had Freddie Romberg as my tutor.
Was Fritz Geneva?
But after 3rd year, sorry?
Was Fritz Geneva there then?
Fritz Geneva never taught me, but he was very close friend. The school was very small.
And Prof. Lewis was running.
Prof. Lewis was the dean and the professor of architecture. And there was that God professor. There was only one professor who had to do everything, control the whole lot. And the intake used to be about 30 a year. And the course was a reformed largely inspired by Bauhaus, basically. And we had people like Hirschfeld and so on in Geelong teaching, who from Bauhaus migrated to Australia. But the Bauhaus was talked about a lot in our school, and we talked a lot about Frank Lloyd Wright and of course and Le Corbusier and so on. So that was the scene at the time. I had taken a year off after my 3 years to get practical experience, which I'd had about a year off, and I went back to India to work in the project office of Le Corbusier, who was designing a new city of Chandigarh. So I worked closely with, not so much with Corbusier because he was coming and going all the time, but I worked on the High Court building at that time, which was the first main administrative building that was being.
Who did you work with? With Fry or with
no. Well, we were all, the same office. We met them socially, of course. Fry and Drew I knew extremely well and became very good friends. And but the person I worked very closely was Pierre Jeanneret, who was Corbusier's cousin. Lovely man. And I have written about that in my memoir for my kids, which I can give you a copy if you're interested. It's an interesting period in my life because I was very inspired by Corbusier naturally because he was such a strong performer, and a name, and his architecture had such strength that we sort of ended up as producing very similar buildings, but which were pale imitation of his work. That's about it amounted to. And in fact, when I came back from Melbourne, it took me 2-3 years to get him out of my system because such a strong impact he had on people around him. And he, sorry?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, well, I mean, he also had a very, very complete life in terms of his first love was painting. You wouldn't believe it, but he used to spend the most of the mornings painting in the office, and in the afternoon he would do architecture, and in the evening he would write. So that was his regular pattern. He followed it even while he was traveling in aircraft. And he was at the height of his career. He was doing this graduate school building in America, and he had finished the education building, Ministry for Education building in Rio de Janeiro. And he was a very close friend of Oscar Niemeyer, who was another hero of ours at the time. And but anyway, so I had a year back. When I came back, I was very inspired, and
Before we get back,
my thesis was very much in the pale imitation of the kind of work Corbusier did, which was my thesis. Finally, a thesis was a documentary film production center for actual programs.
it was a project.
It was an actual project actually in Chandigarh I was working on with him, so I used that as my thesis. And that was never built because I came back to Australia and couldn't follow it up. But when I came back, I fell into my 5th year with Freddie Romberg, and his own background was very much European. And so he naturally, he and I were on a very similar level of architectural approach. And in my final year, I had first-class honors, and I was top of the class, along with a woman, very few women students in those days, and she was very clever. Her name was Helen O'Donnell, who later married a fellow called Tippett, and her name became Helen Tippett. And we were bracketed as first in the class in final year. So that's my school, the university days.
So then you went back to.
Then I went back to
practice in
India
Delhi.
to practice in Delhi, and also taught at Delhi School of Planning.
Do you remember any of your fellow students down at Melbourne that stood out?
In India?
No.
No,
When
in
you were Melbourne?
in Melbourne. Oh yes, quite a lot. I mean, well, there was well, Neville Quarry was a couple of years younger than me, I think. But people who were senior to me, I can remember Jim McCormack was one. Jim Bill was a year or so ahead of me. And Kevin Boland,
Right.
Peter McIntyre. They were all doing fifth year when I was doing my first year or second year, I think. But I had done, I finished a BA course before I came to Australia, so I was in age very similar to these people. But because I had already a Bachelor of Arts degree from Punjab University, and that was majored in physics and maths. So, and the architecture I've never heard of. Because there was no architecture school in India. There's one JJ school in Bombay.
How did you come to choose to be an architect?
Well, that's the interesting one. I've written about that. It's been published. I came to Melbourne to study civil engineering. And civil engineering gave me a year off because I had done physics, maths, and a few other things. So I was in second year civil engineering course building near Grattan Street. And they had some army barracks temporarily put up in front of the engineering school. And it happened to be between the university cafeteria and the engineering buildings. So I used to walk past the architecture school every time I went to have a cup of coffee or something. And one evening, it was a pretty depressing day. The engineering course was very dull and not very inspiring. And they had this, the teachers were, very, very good engineers, but, they just didn't inspire me anyway. So I still had a turban. I was sort of in a Sikh family, so I had this big turban. The only person with a turban in Melbourne. And so everybody knew me because they couldn't avoid it. And I saw one evening pouring with rain. It's like a typical Melbourne winter. And I finished late looking at some reciprocating engines or something in some engineering workshop. And pouring and miserable and cold. And so I went past this architecture school, which was all brightly lit up in the evening. It was about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. And brightly lit with a lot of lights and a lot of drawings, and people were, drinking a glass of wine and sort of fun, having a lot of fun. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. I just walked in. And I walked into the place, and somebody thrust a glass of wine in my hand, and that was it. And I started looking at around, in the world, fascinated by what I saw. And there's a lot of lovely designs of buildings. I thought they were too good to be true. And come to think of it, they were too good to be true. And then there was a tap on my shoulder, and a very burly-looking fellow sort of tapped on me. I looked around, and there was a big man standing there, and he said, "I'm Brian Lewis." They wanted. I said, "I'm Bal Saini." And so we started talking, and he said, "No, that's interesting." And he sort of took me around to show some drawings, and then he dragged me off to his office, which was around the corner. And he said, "I've got a very nice bottle of Spanish sherry with cheers." So we sat down and we started knocking on this bottle of sherry with me sitting there. I never met him before. And so by the time, towards the end of the day, after an hour or so, he said, "Well, look, how about studying architecture? And this is, very good fun," and so on. I said, "Oh, I don't know much about it." So architecture, I didn't know anything about it. Anyway, so by the time we finished the bottle of Spanish sherry, I thought, well, probably not a bad idea. I'll give it a try. And because partly I was a bit not quite impressed by the engineering course. And so it was just that kind of evening. And so I said, "Well, what do I do?" I said, "Don't worry, look, I'll ring up Lewis Matheson, the civil engineering professor. He later on became the founding vice chancellor of Monash University." so Matheson was still working late in his office. He said, I said, what do you have to do? He said, oh, leave it to me, I'll fix it all up. And so he immediately sort of phones the professor of civil engineering, and I still remember his words. He said, oh, Lewis, this is Brian, your Lewis here. He said, how about swapping 2 chows for 1 Sikh? And so that's how I got into architecture. And I said, what do I do? He said, nothing. I said, oh, come up tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Don't go to engineering school, and we'll do the paperwork. One of the girls will do it. And so there I was next morning with a hangover and trying to look for a spare T-square and a set square. Well, that's how I got into architecture. Yeah. Oh.
2 more questions about Melbourne,
Yeah.
that maybe to do with how, after you took your academic post. But
Yeah.
when did Melbourne begin its focus on Asia and South Asia? And what role do you have
I think, well, it is really started when I walked in. There was a lot of Asian students in architecture than any other architecture school in Australia.
Melbourne was had a commitment to the serious
Yes, I
study.
think largely because of Brian.
Right, okay.
He came from Tasmania, and he worked as an engineer in Malaysia, mining engineer, and went on to England, where he studied architecture in Liverpool School. And Liverpool School was run by a fellow called Charles Riley. And this is just before the war. And during the war, of course, they all joined the war. And he was a private in the Australian Army, Brian Lewis. And typical American kind of scene there. I think they kicked him out or something like that. And then he joined the British Army and they made him a brigadier. And so he ended up brigadier in the British Army during the war. And so he had quite a, and then he was at the front in the Middle East somewhere. So he also felt when he came back to Australia and was asked to set up a chair in architecture at the University of Melbourne, which was financed by the Age newspaper. It was called the Age Chair of Architecture. He, after having all these travels and so on, and also the training with the Charles Riley, he felt that the school needed a more cosmopolitan. So he encouraged Asian students to come and study there.
So was there an intellectual atmosphere of interest in growing interest in anthropology in architecture in Britain and Europe at that time? There were people reading
No, I think
anthropology.
his own interest was basically design, of course, but civic design and also architectural history. And they were the 2 strong subjects in Liverpool School of Architecture. And Charles Riley's interest, and they used to call it civic design, but I think it's basically town planning, or urban design, I should say. And he had a number of students from all over the British colonies in Liverpool. And Brian Lewis was a product of that school, and so was 2 or 3 other people. One Haworth, who went to Toronto, and he set up a school of architecture in Toronto, in Canada. And there was another fellow, I don't know their names, but another fellow who started a school of architecture in Cape Town in South Africa. And these were all the boys from the colonies, or the ex-colonies of the British Empire. And they were all graduates from Liverpool School, and and Charles Riley was very well-known architect of his time. And these boys went back to their colonies in Australia and South Africa and so on, and started degree courses in architecture. And the fellow in Adelaide, what was his name? Ralph Jensen. was also a graduate from the same school. So all these people, they were known as the Riley boys.
Okay, I didn't know that story.
Yeah.
So when you'd set up
And
the
so that was the atmosphere. You know,
So you'd worked at Melbourne some time, you'd taken your PhD and set up the tropical architecture program. So when you were offered the job in Brisbane, what did you know of Queensland, and how did you decide to take the position?
Well, that was interesting because in those days the 10-year-old professors were the only one professor in each. There were only about 6 or 7 professors in Australia, one in each school running the whole show, and you had to wait till they retired, and they didn't retire till they were 65. And they all started their schools and careers about the same time. So there was no vacancy until all these, and they all started to retire at the same time, practically. You know, give 1 or 2 years up and down, depending on their age. And so when Brian Lewis retired, he retired I think in '69 or something. I had a PhD by then. And I was an associate professor, or reader they used to call it. And so I was acting professor and head of the school and dean for about a couple of years, I think, in between the appointment of a new professor and Brian Lewis's retirement. The University Council there used to be University Council, not board, in Melbourne University gave me an honorary title and the salary to run the whole show after Brian's retirement. The school was about twice the size of the one in Brisbane at the time, and also planning, the dean of the planning as well. So I had that experience of running a department before I came to Brisbane. In Brisbane, at that time also I was actively involved with the setting of the school in Lae, Papua New Guinea. And it was suggested by the New Guineans that I should really run it. So they offered me the appointment in New Guinea. And at the same time, there was a vacancy here in Brisbane because the professor, Gareth Roberts, had resigned and gone to New South Wales as a Deputy Vice Chancellor. So there was nobody here at that time. So when I was in Melbourne, the school in Queensland also didn't have any professor. It was run by Bill Craig, I think, was acting head at the time. And so it was, and I was editing a news sheet called Cross Section. I was editing at that time, that year. Never Corey took it afterwards, after I left. And so that was I used to stop over to, every time I went to New Guinea, I had to stop overnight in Brisbane before because there was no direct flights or anything from Melbourne. So I would stay overnight and talk to or have a drink with my local correspondent, who was John Dalton. That's how we got to know each other, because I used to stop over to discuss his contribution.
So you knew
to
quite a bit about the Brisbane scene from Dalton?
Well, not really. From Dalton, of course, I knew and written about it, but I had been to Brisbane only once, I think, briefly for one day or something. I vaguely knew the city, and the school was still in the old place somewhere in the city. And so John Dalton said, "Oh, look, there's a job going here. Why don't you sort of think about it?" Anyway, he was the one who persuaded me to show interest in the Brisbane appointment. So I had two choices, but they either go to the New Guinea or to Brisbane. So I thought, well, Brisbane sounds better. So I stayed. So as far as the New Guinea was concerned, I'll find somebody else. So I went back to Melbourne and spread the word around, and one hand went up, and it was Neville Quarry. I said, "You're on." So I shoved him to New Guinea, and I came myself to Brisbane.
So
and it was that sort of scene.
So you saw some potential with the University of Queensland with your interest in tropical architecture? And
Well, that was the main reason.
yeah.
Main reason. And I
And
thought,
did you know about
partly I thought, well, yeah, it's in the tropics, and it'll give me a chance to sort of get something more specifically tropical going. And that was one of my main interests at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was writing a book. So
So did you know from Melbourne about what Cummings and Langer had been doing?
absolutely nothing. I
So
came in
it had no
completely raw, absolutely nothing. I knew nothing about Brisbane, and certainly, definitely knew nothing about the school. Absolutely nothing.
So that work that they did back then in the 40s had no national reception?
Absolutely no. I had no concept, no idea. I completely out of the blue. I was familiar with Brisbane a little bit, I mean, in the sense that I read something somewhere. But I travelled widely through tropical Australia as part of my own research work. And when I was doing my PhD, the Nuffield Foundation gave me a fairly good grant to do some field work. And at that time, I was running the tropical graduate program in Melbourne. So I got two students, master's students, to help me with the field work. So Nuffield grant more or less went to them. We hired a car and went round. So I was familiar with tropical Australia, yeah.
But what about the traditional house forms? Because Boyd was writing about that in Melbourne, wasn't he?
Well, I might have read it, but I wasn't particularly. I vaguely knew that it's the sort of, origins are from Indian bungalow, and which I was familiar with the Indian history, reasonable colonial history quite well. But I didn't study it any seriously or anything like that. That was only when I came here. And
So what year did you start in
1970. I was appointed towards the end of 1972. I took up my appointment in 1973 because I had already I was also doing a lot of consulting work for international organizations, United Nations. So the Australian government had an aid program for slum clearance and squatter settlement programs in Korea, India and Indonesia. And so they asked me and a fellow called Mendelssohn to go to these places and report as to what kind of aid program they could offer for these problems in these three countries. So I had committed myself to do that work for 3 months at the end of 1972. So my appointment formally was postponed for 3 months in order for me to finish that commitment for the Australian government.
When was you went to practice in Delhi for years? You
That
said?
was
When
in
that?
1956 to 1960, yeah. In 60 and 1960 I came here, yeah.
And where did you work then?
Delhi.
But which office, do you remember?
No, I have no private practice. I was just designing something and also teaching at the Delhi Polytechnic, which later was in the middle of being made into a university and moved its campus into a new building, called the Delhi School of Planning and Architecture. And so I was in Delhi all the time. And at that time I worked, the other people who came to India from other parts of the world was people like Charles Correa and a few others who became very close friends because we were on the same age and the same background.
So when you took up the position, how did you find the school?
Well, when I took up the position, it was very interesting because I came for the interview, and one of the first challenges I was presented was that I had to work with a very difficult man who was running the planning department, a fellow called Lewis Keeble. And Lewis Keeble had a reputation for being a troublemaker, as somebody called it. So I came for the interview, and I was booked into a motel in Coronation Motel somewhere in the Coronation Drive. That was the only place you could stay. And I was very tired. I was flown from Melbourne. I had a full day in my work. So I had the interview at 9 o'clock next morning. And about midnight, I get a phone call in my motel room from Lewis Keeble. And he said, "Oh, look, you don't know me, but I'm Lewis Keeble, and you're being interviewed tomorrow. I just wanted informally, could I have a word with you before you go to sleep?" I said, "Well, it's quite late and tired." He said, "No, I'll come and pick you up, and I can make you an omelette or something." And so he dragged me off to his house, and he wanted to know what I was like and what I did, you see. So we had quite a long session. I think it went on till about 2 o'clock in the morning. And we talked just about everything, all the prohibited, subjects like religion, politics, sex, all these things which were normally people don't talk to when they meet first time. But don't forget, he raised them, so I had to respond. Anyway, by that time, we sort of understood each other and became quite good friends, very close friends actually, in fact. So after the interview, after my appointment, we had lunch, and we agreed that I won't tell him how to teach planning and he won't tell me how to teach architecture. And we got on fine. And that was it. That was my first,
So what was the...
But the department was actually, I got a bit of a shock, because the department was, to put very mildly, was fairly dysfunctional at the time. It was firstly it was split up into two. The first 2-3 years were in Michi building, up there. And the last 2 years, and the dean's office and the workshop was in the tower. And so it turned out that the tower people and the Michi building people didn't talk to each other. They were living in two different worlds. And they used to send little written notes to each other. It was that bad. I didn't know that I was being given a poison chalice, so to speak. And so I immediately sensed that I think the main administration seemed to be in the tower, and perhaps I should. And it's quite possible that the first 3 years were being taught in the Michi building, and me, with my primary interest in graduate programs and research, I might be alienated from the undergraduate teaching even more. And it's probably, with the conditions as split as they are, I made a deliberate decision to set up my office in the Michi building to make sure that I don't alienate people further. And that was a wise decision, I think. And but my first challenge was to bring the two distinct groups together. And I really didn't quite succeed, simply because they were physically located in two different buildings. And I was hovering from one to the other, but mostly in Michi building, until we got the new building under one roof. And then we started to see some semblance of a cohesive, unified Department of Architecture with similar aims and so on. And don't forget that that was also a time when there was a general questioning of education worldwide, with the revolt of the late 60s, and especially in France and the United States, there were big shifts taking place and changes of curriculums and so on. And to smaller degree in England and Australia and Canada. But mainly in France and mainly in the United States, sub-schools. And there was a fair bit of argument going on. The new areas the students were demanding new areas of studies like environment, energy issues, and which fell very neatly into my lap, because I was studying architecture, tropical architecture, and also social issues. And both of those I tried to encourage in the school right from the beginning, with the appointments of Steve Zoklai and later on Greg Benford took up with man environment studies. The subject was established before him. So that's, but the school was pretty much divided, but I think people sort of didn't talk to each other much. So it is sort of, my major challenge was really to get them to talk to each other. And that was, that happened much more quickly than I thought. I mean, at least people were more polite and talked. So I think, and you need that in a small department, it shows. I mean, it's a big thing. It doesn't matter. People go on and doing their things. But in a small department, you really have to work together. And so it had to be done, and it worked reasonably well, I think, despite all the history of dissensions and so on.
Were there any graduate students before you started bringing them in?
No,
so you really set up the
there was one. I had to start from scratch. I think there was one student who was enrolled for a master's, but nobody was supervising him, and there was called Greg Berkman.
Oh yes,
Greg Berkman. He was, at least on paper, he was enrolled, and he was working in the staff architect's office in Gucci building somewhere. And the other people, my first PhD students were fellow colleagues, staff members. One was Lewis Keeble himself, who wanted to do a PhD. And the other one was Steve Zoklai. They were my first two PhD students who didn't need any supervision. They were mature and experienced. They knew exactly what they were doing. They needed some guidance in structuring the thing, but not much. And they both finished part-time in the record time, and because they were partly, disciplined and mature, and they knew what they were doing, so it wasn't so difficult for them to get their PhDs. But they were the two students. And the third one might have been, now I'm just recording a memory. Graham Durucci was one, I think. He had been already enrolled, but he wasn't getting much help from anybody.
And you must take on Paul Memmott sometime around there.
Paul was enrolled later on, I think. Paul and
He would have finished in 78 or something, isn't it?
yeah, well, we're talking about 73,
Right,
74.
okay. Yeah.
We haven't got that far. Paul came much later.
Yeah.
Paul came in much later. In fact, I think he took much longer than most people to do his PhD. In the end, he produced enough work to give him 2 degrees. I mean, very thorough. And Paul was a very, very difficult person to supervise. I was supervising. I had to supervise because the only one to supervise the PhD. So there was no choice. But so I was enrolling everybody. Having most done my PhD without a supervisor, I was always open that everybody should give it a chance. Whether they do it, but do put fairly tough assessment process to make sure they are assessed by the top. But don't close doors for opportunities to study. That was my basic approach, partly conditioned by my own experience, personal experience. So I was always very open-ended to take any subject anybody wants to study. If I can't help them, I'll try and guide them to get the help from somebody else. And so I had all kinds of people doing different topics. Well, some of the early students I remember was John Hawkins.
Yeah, that's right.
And
and
Paul Memmott. John Hawking was easy. His was a construction topic with overlays of cultural issues in terms of Vanuatu. He was doing some field work.
Gilbert Island. Yeah.
Gilbert Island.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting work he did. And but that was easy to do. But Paul, I found it hard because I could deal with architecture and environment. But by the time he got into his research and field studies with his tribe up north, he was into behavioral issues. So I got Glenn McBride to help out. with because he was doing animal behavior in the psychology department, mainly studying chickens. But he knew, he had read Conrad Lorenzo and all these behavioral scientists. I mean, he was fairly familiar with that, but he could actually guide Paul quite well. And then he got into linguistics. You know, Paul kept on moving. You know, his research areas were expanding, so when he got into linguistics, of course, both Glenn McBride and I couldn't help him, so I had to get Bruce Rigsby, the professor of anthropology, to come in to see it. So he had 3 professors supervising him towards the end of his thesis. And I know because I used to meet in my office at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we used to go on with the 3 of them, 4 of them sitting trying to help him out with his work.
But you did have a fairly interdisciplinary view of Arctics, didn't you? Because I remember when I was a student, I started in 77, there was a course called Interdisciplinary Studies where we did environmental psychology and anthropology, and McBride taught us.
So that was the man-environment studies. It was 101, what was it title? It was shared between 3 departments, psychology, architecture, and geography.
So you always saw architecture as
I
an
always
intersection of disciplines.
Yes, I saw as a thing, because when I went to do this work in New Guinea, I realized that the issues of building in those developing countries and tropical countries were not really specifically architectural problems, where they were enmeshed with other issues of the levels of skills and technological levels of these countries, the politics of the countries which dictated the building process, and economic conditions, and all these issues were impinged on what you produced, and so my areas of interest were quite wide. And at that time, I had written quite a lot about that at that time, which was noticed by like UNESCO and so on. And so UNESCO asked me to help them with their social sciences section. So I was consultant to UNESCO for about 20 years in the Paris social science section, which was at that time when I was invited to advise them, was run by Richard Hoggart, who was the British educationist, very famous British educationist, who wrote some definitive policies, post-war policies of the British educational policies in schools. He was the Deputy Director General of UNESCO at the time, and so he had read some papers, and he invited me to join as a consultant social sciences section. So I was doing quite toing and froing between Paris and Melbourne at the time, and then the Australian National Commission for UNESCO invited me to become a member, which I was member. I did most of the good work with them during the Whitlam days. And Whitlam had a very, very enlightened minister, Tom Uran, who was a minister for urban and regional development. And he put me on an advisory committee to himself for the United Nations Habitat Human Settlements Conference in Vancouver in 1976. And I was head of the non-government Australian delegation to that conference. And that happened by the time I had taken my appointment in Brisbane. So I was toing and froing a lot to that as well. We have more energy at that age. Yeah.
So you appointed Steve Zoccolai, and we're going to interview Steve.
Well, I had a problem, because I felt that if the students are demanding change, we need people who can bring new directions. And also there was a certain amount of, how do I put the word? I think there were too many people who'd been here for a long time, and they needed some new blood. Let's to put it simply. And I realized that right from the beginning. And but you could in those days you could move people or hire people because they were all on tenure. So you could wait till they were 65 before you could create a vacancy, and then you get somebody else. So it wasn't easy. I mean, that was a very slow and fairly difficult task. And so I felt that and yeah, persuaded to get some new positions, a couple of new positions, and so on. But the things I needed was some new blood, basically. And my only contact overseas who could assist me with some staffing issue problems was good old Otto Königsberger, who was running the AA school. I had never studied in AA or know anything about AA, but I happened to know Königsberger, who running the school there. And Königsberger and Steve Zoklai had written a book on climate at that time, which was a very good book. And Steve was working for Region Polytechnic at the time. So I said to Otto, I rang him up and I said, look, I really want a good man to teach architectural science. And he said, well, Steve is looking for a way out. He wants to get out of London. He's sick of it or something. And I said, well, look, I'll ring him up. And I never met him before. So I rang him up and said, would you be interested in a job in Brisbane? And Steve had an international reputation by then. He had written a couple of books on solar energy and in buildings and so on. So he had the reputation and he wanted a change. So we got Steve Zoklai. And the first thing he did was wanted to finish his PhD under my supervision about a subject he knew more about than I did.
So did you see?
And the other people, I said, well, look, I also need some staffing people to bump up the design area. So he interviewed on my behalf with a fellow called Hetherington, who was an Australian legation man to interview people in London. And that's how we appointed two people. That was Britt Anderson and followed closely by Kaniger. And they were both appointed as lecturers in design. So the three appointments actually were, on hindsight, I think they were excellent appointments for the job.
Yes, they were. They certainly made the school that I went through.
Exactly. But we needed that to get the school out of the very parochial Queensland kind of.
You must have appointed Peter Bycroft too? Was he an appointment of yours? Because he was doing the sort of...
He was a student.
He was a student?
He was a fellow student of Paul Mamet.
That's right.
Same class.
He was teaching, he was teaching man-environment
He
studies
he was very much interested and I did encourage him quite a lot.
So did you
Where
see...
is he? Is he now here in Noosa, isn't it?
Yeah, I think he's moved back to Brisbane. I spoke to him recently. There's a reunion of the class of... Which year is it?
68?
The group that started in
I haven't seen him for
67
years,
apparently, having a reunion here.
Oh,
And
I see.
Peter and Paul Mamet are part of the organisers of it.
Okay, right, okay, yeah.
So I did see him the other day just about this reunion.
They were classmates.
He's a consultant.
They were classmates. So
HR
they were both interested. They spent a lot of time with me at that time. They were very keen to do graduate work. And Paul was interested in the Aboriginal affairs, which I had written a paper on Aboriginal affairs as part of my own researches in tropical Australia, which actually was a good paper, looking back on it, even if I pat myself on it. It was written in 1966 about the Aboriginal housing problem, which was published in Architecture Australia. And it was then, later on, commented by Gough Whitlam, who was the leader of the opposition in those days, and Charles Perkin, and a couple of anthropologists who wrote a commentary on my paper. So both of them were published simultaneously. So that got architectural profession interested in Aboriginal issues. And when Paul suggested to me that he wanted to study Aboriginal housing problems, I warmed to it straight away and encouraged him. I said, go for it, because I was myself very much interested in it.
So did you see one large field that went from hard architectural science and thermal studies of building performance through to the people environment studies kind of area, or did you see it as... How did you think about tropical architecture once captured all of that early on.
Yeah, it's a very generic term. Tropical architecture is all things to all people. I mean, it's
Yes,
also,
exactly.
even tropical, the definition of tropics is also very. I mean, Australia is tropical only, a very small part, Cairns and so on, which is hot. Most people associate the tropical architecture to hot, wet climates. The climates you find in the West Indies and Malaysia, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and so on. But there's a vast amounts of tropical belt, which is not hot, wet, and it's all desert. The whole of North Africa and Middle East and so on. And this vast area we're talking about is hot and dry. So you have hot, dry, and hot, wet. So hot, wet is the one which is more troublesome in terms of design. Hot, dry is much easier to deal with. You can have your evaporative coolers and so on. So the hot, dry is, in Australia, is about 70% hot, dry. And no people live there, apart from some Aborigines. And the northeastern fringe is the hot, wet climate. So, but it's really tropical architecture, generically called hot, wet climate. But because the tropics runs on a belt which encompasses both climates, so one should really say hot climates rather than tropical climates. Because the hot is the common denominator for both regions.
It just struck me that you always try to keep together the cultural issues and the scientific building performance issues and see it as one field rather than to separate them. Would that be the case? Or?
Yeah, partly mainly because I came into architecture much later, and my background was engineering. My first preference in my life's career was making films. And I was enrolled for
Did you ever do that?
No, I nearly did before I came to Australia, because one of the things I wanted to study was making films, and I designed a center for documentary films. But I had been admitted to the school in the UCLA, or the School of Dramatic Arts, to study film production, cinematography, and but the cost of, I had no funds, and the cost of study in America at that time was huge, and so I was in a coffee house in Delhi, sitting with some old friends. This is after the post-partition of India, we were in Delhi, and I was talking to some old college mates of mine, and we were all sort of at sea. We had no idea what we were going to do with ourselves, and I said, "Oh, look." So I must have looked a bit dejected and ordered a cup of coffee, and we just sat there, and I said, I just had the news that it's going to be too expensive to go to America, and I can't study filmmaking. So then one of the students said, "Why don't you go to Australia?" I said, "Australia? No, I'll go to England." England. Applied they had no courses in filmmaking as such. So I applied to, my next was civil engineering, so I applied to all the universities in Manchester and Birmingham and so on. And I got replies to say that, "Oh, well, you're fine, we'll admit you, but you'll have to wait a year because we have to give first preference to our ex-servicemen who are now returning to finish their studies, and they're flooding the universities. You'll have to wait for a year." And at that age of about 18 or 20, you don't want to wait another year. 1 year is like 10 years. So then when this fellow came and said, "Why not Australia?" I said, "Australia? Where's that?" "Oh, just have it." So I looked at an atlas to find out where it was, and also realized that there was a Australian High Commission in Delhi. So I went off to their office and asked them if they had any universities in Australia. They said, "Oh yes, not one, but 6 or 7, one in each state." So I still remember, I wrote longhand, those aerograms, all the blue aerograms.
Yes.
I wrote to all the 6, 7 universities to please tell me whether you would admit me for a course in civil engineering, and these are my qualifications. And the very first university, I didn't know any from one state or the city from the other. So the first people who immediately replied straight away was University of Melbourne.
Mm.
And that's how I ended up in Melbourne.
But
Sure.
you became involved in a film later on. You were involved in Timberentin, and you got a grant to do some research about the Queensland
Oh,
house.
well, yeah, but I've been had a marginal interest in that. I even now fiddle around with making
How-
DVDs and so on.
But
I enjoy it.
how did that process go to make Timberentin? Because you got a grant from the
I
Queensland
don't think I
government?
got any. I can't remember now. This was long ago. But I do remember being on a film about something or the other. And who was it? Banner, somebody?
Max Banner,
Max
yeah.
Banner.
Yeah. Well, he was making the film, not
Yes.
me.
But you were in the film. You
Oh,
were-
well, he asked me to be on the film.
No,
But
but I
I
thought it came from the research that you were doing, and I thought.
at that time, I think. When did he make that film? Can you remember?
Can't remember what year it was.
74, I think.
Is it?
Were we interviewed Max?
Really, as early as that?
Yes, we've interviewed Max.
You did a one-to-one with him.
I might have been raving about how nice these houses are and so on because I just discovered them myself, you see. So, so they were quite new to me in that sense. And I started looking at them a bit more with some interest.
Perhaps we could ask some questions about
Yeah.
the architectural scene in Brisbane. So, when you arrived as the new professor of the university school,
Yeah.
who were the main characters around town? Who do you think was doing progressive work?
Well, well, one of my conduits, of course, was John Dalton. And I met, also fairly early, I met Robin Gibson and Blair Wilson. And Blair Wilson actually happened to be on the interviewing committee for my appointment. So I would think those three people were probably the beginnings of my introduction to the profession. And now I'm just trying to think who stand out. The other people, I think Eddie Cord is one. No, he was trying to set up a course in QUT. At that time, QUT and UQ didn't talk to each other. And but we two got on quite well, so we would just go and nick off at a pub and have a lunch or something and sort out issues. I personally have had no problems with dealing with QUT or QIT as it was called, because mainly because Eddie was a nice friend and very good. And later on, Tom Heath was appointed, and I was on his selection committee and as a referee as well. And Tom Heath had known him because he was my fellow editorial advisor of the Architecture Australia in the 60s. Tom Heath was a member of the board, and I was also, so we saw each other quite a bit with Peter Keys and all the others. So Tom Heath and I, so we used to meet informally. I mean, Tom Heath and I regularly had lunch once a month in town, which nobody knew, and we used to sort of swap old stories and swap issues of two departments and experience of where we can cooperate. But we found it very hard to get our colleagues to cooperate with each other. But at my level, I got on extremely well with
So, were there any particular projects that were going up at the time that you were interested in? Or?
Well, the projects were actually, it's not really projects. We were at the time governed by Belke Peterson. And Belke Peterson and I were on the opposite camps. And one of the things that was happening was he was demolishing a historic building on the corner of Ellis Street and George Street. The pub there.
The Bellevue.
Bellevue pub, yeah.
Yes, called Celeb. Yeah.
And I was right in it, and I got the school involved actually, and hopefully even Zelman Khan, who was Vice Chancellor, to protest against that, and there were demonstrations in the city and marches and so on, and so I was quite involved with that one, and a lot of press statements of that time will probably tell you more than I can, but that was quite a big event at the time.
I was there that night. By
Were you?
I was at a band playing at a pub down the street, and we
Yeah.
heard it was happening, and
Yeah.
a lot of the architecture students were there, and we all ran up the street and
Yeah, yeah.
yelled at the
And
demolition
architecture
workers.
students, both from QUT and from the university, united for that cause.
Yeah,
QUT, of course, had vested interest because it's next door to it.
yeah, that's right.
And so that was one of the events I can recall.
Mm. Did you think? Did you have the impression that there was a regional culture, like a regional language of form, or set of ideas, or
Not really.
not really?
Not really. I mean, they were tinkering with the idea. I mean, people like John Dalton and so on were. John used to talk a lot about that. About
Well, he certainly
photography.
attempted it in his buildings.
Yeah,
didn't
but
he, in the
in
domestic
his
ones.
buildings. But you know, one of my criticism of John, right in the beginning, but which he changed later on, was that his balconies and his terraces were too small for tropical living. You can't live out there. You know, it's not like you know Leeds where he came from. I mean, Leeds is always raining in Leeds, and it's cold and miserable. And somebody coming from Leeds trying to design buildings for the tropics, he had these little 1 meter deep balconies, and and I said, look, what do you do with this balcony? I mean, you can't put a table there and sit around. Have a nice big room. So they ended up almost like another outdoor room. So the veranda, the concept of veranda was more theoretical than practical. I mean, they've studied all the colonial buildings. The veranda has very good use and all this kind of thing. But the veranda has a special function. People live there. They live more in veranda than inside. And so this is a message which I tried to get through or get across at that time. But the architects weren't practicing. The restaurants were all in the city centre, all air conditioned, dark, and nobody was out there. I think you've got a river there. Fortunately for us, Sally Ann Atkinson became mayor. And fortunately for us, she happened to have a daughter who was studying architecture. And another one was studying sound planning. And so she had a vested interest. And so she used to rope me in socially, I'm talking about. And we would argue about what can be done to Brisbane. And I said, look, Brisbane, people should have outdoor life. It's a river city, and all you're putting is motorways. And you can't, motorways are dividing the city from the water. And there should be cafes, and this engineers think differently. But, this motorway along Coronation Drive, I mean, that was already built by 73, And they were already building something very similar to the other side where the
planned for it, yes.
That's the seriously thinking about it. I suppose we hadn't got to put that stop to that one. So one of the good things that came out was to set up a river development committee, a riverside development committee, which was headed by Kozlowski from the town planning department, and to get some control in terms of not putting just motorways along the Brisbane River. So Brisbane River was focused as an important feature of Brisbane around that time.
Yes, certainly was.
And that changed the whole architecture. I mean, the South Bank was already under construction by Robin Gibson's.
Yes. And
my criticism of that was that when you come into the foyer of those art gallery and the performing arts and so on, all you see is a road and so on. Why don't you face it to the river and to the thing?
Yes, indeed.
I should be at a right angle. Anyway, the building had gone too far, and it's already had it was too late to do anything about it. But that was the kind of issues that were coming up.
One of the themes we're trying to follow, talking to people, is about modernism and people early on about what Cummings did, trying to bring modernism into the school and so on. Yeah. But at your end of the period, I guess, we're interested in the rise of critical regionalism, and so quite interested in the way that Dalton started to use hip roofs and Hayes and Scott had done some similar things before that. Yeah. But then they went
Peter Heath.
Then they tended to follow Gibson and go flat and easy. Yeah. So could you reflect a little bit for us about like there must have been some tensions in your time between the rusted-on modernists and the people who were interested in trying to find
regional, you mean?
cultural relations.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there was a there was no distinct preferences. There were three groups of architects. There was the sort of the slightly more academic-minded who were talking into the regionalism and so on. And but architects, even who were working in the regions, like a good example was Peter Cheney. Peter Cheney was one of my first master's students when I was in Melbourne. He did a external master's course while he was practicing in Rockhampton. And his study was how to build in black soil country. There was a lot of movement of soil. And it was still a construction problem, not the design problem. And so there were a number of architects working even in the regional Queensland who were still putting up sort of more. You can see the building. I mean, from the building records, you can see what they were building. And but the emphasis to veranda actually came quite late in the 80s in modern buildings. I think a lot of the inspiration came from our school. It just, the practicing architects weren't really practicing tropical architecture. That was my impression. They had all the information. I mean, Steve Rockler was giving them all the information on climate. They weren't using it. And of course, we weren't using it in our school either. I mean, we were all involved with design. I don't know. I mean, I always felt that what Steve was doing was offering architectural science and not getting it applied enough in the studios. And the only way you could get it applied in the studios was for the studio masters to apply it. And studio teachers themselves weren't quite at ease with or familiar with designing for climate, in the sense that they could use Steve's work into the studios. So the studios weren't showing, some of the work of the students wasn't showing enough of designing for climate, from my point of view, or from Steve's point of view. And the reason was that the people who are most influential in studio work are the studio teachers, tutors. So we got to really train them before we can train the students. So that issue probably still exists, I'm not sure, but that is as I saw it at the time. And I don't think we ever overcame this problem.
And what did you make of Karl Langer's approach to tropical housing, what he'd written about it, and his ideas of town planning as well in relation to the climate?
In what way?
Did you think his approach was good? Because you said John Dalton couldn't really do this.
Well, John Dalton also did a lot of good work, and the fact that he was discussing these issues was music to my ears, because I mean, a lot of people weren't even discussing it.
It seems like in the late 40s into the 50s, the big thing was slab on ground for thermal mass. So that's what Cummings and Langer were teaching them was. I mean, there were patio areas, but not elevated verandas, because they were committed to slab on ground construction because of the thermal mass that would be involved in that. So that's a very big break to go back to the elevated house form.
You're right. You're right. You're totally right. And I think that Karl Langer did raise these issues. I read some of his papers when I came here, although I didn't have anything to do with him because he was already out of the picture. And Mrs. Karl Langer was very influential in the gallery, and I saw her a few times, and I was very impressed with her. But Karl Langer I never met, but what I read, what he had written, he was actually much more aware of these issues than some of the people who followed him.
Yes, it does seem astonishing to us that Langer had done probably one of the first solar geometry schemes for the
I only regret that
specific.
he wasn't still alive when I was here, because I think we would found something quite common.
But before you came, by the 1960s, people had forgotten about it.
Oh yeah,
No,
very much.
so
Very much.
Bill Carr was building a solar house
Exactly. And
in
it's-
the late
it's-
60s.
I-
He knew nothing about
I,
Langer, and it
Yeah.
just seems like a chain of
Yeah.
forgetting.
yeah. Bill's is a sad story that he didn't continue something on those lines. I think there's a lot of unfortunate incidents, but we won't go into those.
Yeah.
But when at my age in my ninth decade, I sort of, you always like to look at the bright side of things rather than the negative ones, because you can afford to do that, and a lot of the things sort of fall into the place, and probably not that important when you look back on it, and you try to distill things that really were worth arguing or fighting or doing. And there are a lot of good things went on. But that was interesting times when these issues were starting to be raised. And I think it's mainly 80s that it started to get off the ground properly. Until before that, in the 70s, nothing. How about some coffee? Let's have a quick.
I think that's a good point to pause, unless you wanted to add something else. Or
Oh, look, I can go on for hours.
let's do the coffee then.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I mean,
Thank you.